If war were to break out directly between Israel and Qatar, the consequences would extend far beyond the Middle East. It would reshape diplomacy, economics, military alignments, humanitarian conditions, and global stability. Today we explore what such a conflict could truly mean, not as speculation, but as a realistic mapping of possible outcomes. We analyze what might happen to energy markets, alliances, refugee flows, global trade, and how major powers would react. The first impact would be diplomatic fallout. Qatar has long served as a mediator in the Israel-Hamas conflict. It hosts key discussions, facilitates ceasefire efforts, and is recognized for its relatively neutral role. When that role is violated by a military strike on Qatari soil, trust erodes immediately. Allies across the Gulf will question whether hosting negotiations is safe or whether neutrality is respected. Countries that once aligned more closely with Israel or remained publicly silent may speak out. International norms of sovereignty would be tested. The United States, which relies on both Israeli cooperation and Gulf state partnerships, would be caught in a difficult position between supporting Israel's security arguments and upholding international law. Other countries in the Arab League, in Southeast Asia, and even in Europe would begin re-evaluating treaties, alliances, and defense pacts in light of what this breach means for regional security. An economic shock would follow. Energy markets are highly sensitive to Middle East instability. Oil and gas supply chains often pass near the Arabian Peninsula, over the seas, through straits, pipelines, and refineries that are vulnerable to disruption. If ports are damaged or shipping lanes threatened, insurance premiums skyrocket, transportation costs rise, and energy prices surge globally. Nations dependent on energy imports in Asia, Europe, and Africa would feel the pain through higher fuel bills, increased inflation, and possibly rationing or temporary energy shortages. Manufacturers, logistics companies, airlines, and everything that depends on fuel would face rising costs, pushing consumer prices. On the humanitarian front, refugee and displacement crises would likely intensify. Civilians in Qatar and in affected areas might flee conflict zones, even if violence remains relatively localized. Neighboring countries could face influxes of people seeking safety. As with past conflicts, human suffering would include injuries, loss of infrastructure, displacement, shortages of food, water, medical care, and damage to schools and hospitals. International aid agencies would be stretched. The risk of disease, malnutrition, and mental health crises could increase. The long-term social and educational disruption for affected families could leave scars for years. Military escalation is a real risk. Once the threshold of open conflict is crossed, retaliation is almost certain. Israel might target support networks located in other countries. Qatar might respond through diplomatic, economic, or even paramilitary actions if able. Proxy engagements may emerge. Non-state actors, regional powers, or allied states might become involved to begin as a bilateral conflict into a wider regional war. Air bases, ports, and naval assets may become targets. Countries that have defense pacts with either side might feel pressure to take sides or offer logistical, intelligence, or financial support. Protect their interests, escalating what in such a conflict scenario, global superpowers and external actors would be heavily involved. The United States would likely face diplomatic pressure to moderate Israel's actions or to ensure civilian protection. China, Russia, and European powers would either condemn or attempt mediation. Military sales, intelligence cooperation, and strategic bases would be re-examined. Countries might increase defense spending or enter new alliances to position themselves for instability. Global arms manufacturers could make gains. Public opinion in democratic nations could influence foreign policy, pushing governments to demand more accountability or humanitarian protection. Sanctions and economic penalties are likely. If Israel's strike on Qatar is perceived as violating international laws or norms, international bodies, including the UN, EU, or others, may impose sanctions or diplomatic consequences. Restrictions on trade, finance, travel, and arms export licenses might be considered. Qatar may push for legal redress in international forums. Israel may face isolation from certain global forums. Trade deals might be reviewed or suspended. Such economic penalties can ripple outward, affecting corporations, investors, and ordinary citizens wherever their supply chains or markets overlap. Energy security would become a central concern. Countries heavily reliant on imported oil, gas, or LNG would seek alternative sources. Renewable energy markets might gain acceleration. Governments might increase strategic reserves, diversify energy partners, and expedite infrastructure projects to reduce dependence on unstable regions. Oil-producing countries might benefit short-term from price spikes, but longer-term their own stability might suffer if regional infrastructure or relationships are damaged. Global financial markets would likely react strongly. Uncertainty breeds volatility. Investors generally hate ambiguity. When conflict risks rise, capital flees risky assets, bond yields shift, currencies of smaller or emerging markets may weaken. Insurance premiums for shipping, aviation, and infrastructure damage increase. Commodities beyond fuel, like metals, agricultural goods, may experience price spikes. Governments may issue warnings about exposure to geopolitical risk. Stock exchanges might slide. Sovereign debt ratings of countries with close ties to either side could be reviewed with concern. One more possible effect is on migration and refugee flows beyond immediate neighbors. Past conflicts have created diasporas and long-term displacement. People who escape violence in affected areas might settle in Europe, Asia, or Africa, creating pressure on immigration systems and social services. Global awareness grows, as do protests, diaspora advocacy, and demands for international humanitarian. Another dimension is cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and information control. In modern conflicts, the battle for hearts and minds happens online just as much as in real life. Hackers might target critical infrastructure, government communications, or military networks. Social media platforms could see heightened propaganda, rumor spread, or state-sponsored information campaigns from both sides and their allies. Censorship or surveillance may increase in countries fearing exposure to information leaks or unrest from angry publics. Tech companies might be pressured by governments to limit content or cooperate with security agencies. Legal and normative precedents may be challenged. Attacks on sovereign territory that was previously considered off-limits could change conceptions about what is acceptable in warfare. Rules of engagement, war crimes investigations, international tribunal involvement could rise. Countries may rethink their interpretation of sovereignty, civilian protection, use of force in diplomacy. Precedents set by such a war could be invoked in future conflicts elsewhere worldwide. For ordinary people, lives could change in many subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Fuel costs at the pump may skyrocket. Grocery bills may climb as transportation costs increase. Electric bills might go up if energy supply chains are disrupted. Travel plans might be canceled because of airspace restrictions or geopolitical advisories. Insurance premiums might rise. Stock market losses might affect retirement savings. And in societies far from the conflict zone, people may feel rising anxiety, polarization. Political debates over foreign policy and national security will intensify. Media coverage and public perception would also shift. Breaking news, live reporting, maps, visuals of damage, commentary from experts, opinion pieces would flood global news channels. Social media chatter would increase. Misinformation risks spike. Public opinion could lean more strongly toward one side or another, depending on cultural, religious, or ideological ties. Governments may find themselves balancing between strategic alliances and domestic pressure. In response, diplomatic efforts might intensify. Neutral countries and international organizations may try to broker ceasefires or peace talks more aggressively. Pressure from the United Nations or regional bodies could increase. Economic incentives, sanctions, or aid might be used as leverage to prevent wider conflict. International law might be invoked in courts or in public forums to condemn acts against sovereignty, civilian harm, or violations of previous agreements. Countries may also begin to reconfigure their defense postures. In the Gulf, states may invest in missile defense systems, radar, and anti-aircraft defenses. They may also reinforce alliances, seek security guarantees, or even establish mutual defense agreements. Naval assets may be repositioned. Military contractors and defense industry firms may see rising demand. This scenario of war between Israel and Qatar would not be quick or contained. Even if short-lived, the ripple effects globally would be felt for months or even years. Economies could suffer, political alliances shift, humanitarian crises deep, public faith in international diplomacy tested, and the world's idea of peace and safety questioned. Ultimately, while the hope remains that war can be avoided, thinking through these possibilities helps us see what's at stake, not just for those in the Middle East, but for everyone. If we want a more stable, more just world, we must push for diplomacy, for respect of sovereignty, for humanitarian protections. Only through sustained attention, pressure, and care can such spirals of violence be prevented, or, if they do occur, mitigated so they do not become catastrophes that ripple across the globe.